I don't give many teaching homilies, if I could call it that. But the second reading we have today, first of all, I thought is a little opaque, maybe a little obscure. It needs a little explanation, some parts of it. And it also seemed like a really good opportunity to talk about one piece of doctrine in the church and the implications for us. And so Paul writes, through one man sin entered the world, and through sin death. And thus death came to all men, inasmuch as all sinned. And this then really is the core of our doctrine of original sin. But I find as I talk to people that doctrine is not very well understood by everyone. And so one man, Adam, sins. As a result of that sin, death comes into the world, and then that is visited upon every human being afterwards. And here's how the Catechism describes original sin. The overwhelming misery which oppresses men and their inclination toward evil and death. And so both of those things I think we understand, right? We understand the suffering that comes to us in the world, and we also understand our own inclination, often against our will really, towards sin. So these two things cannot be understood apart from their connection with Adam's sin and the fact that he has transmitted to us a sin with which we are all born afflicted, a sin which is the death of the soul. And so the first thing to understand is that the sin of Adam is just that. It's a sin that Adam committed. And I'll come back to that word in a minute. It was a personal sin on his part. But that sin of Adam brings consequences, which we kind of lump into the word death. Sin, first of all, brought death to Adam, and we include Eve in Adam's sin, because through that sin, Adam lost some of the favors he enjoyed, that he and Eve enjoyed. And we call those things preternatural gifts. Praeter in Latin just means beyond. So they're kind of gifts beyond our human nature, at least the things that we normally experience. And there are three of those. The three, sometimes they're just called the three great privileges or something. Infused knowledge. So Adam and Eve did not have to go to school, Actually, there was nobody to teach them, right? They were the first ones. Infused knowledge. What theologians call integrity. In other words, they didn't experience a split between what they wanted to do and what they enjoyed doing. We experience what we call concupiscence. Paul says, the good that I want to do, I don't do. And the evil that I don't want to do, I find myself doing. And I think we all understand that experience of Paul's, this kind of split in us. We call that concupiscence. Adam and Eve did not experience that. They experienced what we call integrity. And then the third preternatural gift is body immortality. Adam and Eve possessed these gifts before the fall. But with the sin of Adam, those gifts were lost. Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. That's kind of an image we might see, right? But Paul writes, and thus death came to all men inasmuch as all sinned. Well, and we could say, well, wait a minute, I didn't do anything. That was Adam's fault, you know? And so the Catechism asks this question: how did the sin of Adam become the sin of all his descendants? And it answers the question this way: the whole human race is in Adam as in one body of one man. In other words, it talks about the unity of the human race. And so, because all of the human race is caught up in Adam, in the human nature, you know, what Adam does affects the rest. But even given that answer, the Catechism acknowledges that original sin is a mystery. It's really too profound that we'll ever completely understand it, right, as human beings. But by revelation, we do know that Adam received his original gifts of holiness, original justice, not for himself alone, but for all human nature. And so Adam committed a personal sin, but this sin affects us because it affects our human nature. And so we don't commit that sin, we contract it, right? In other words, we inherit a human nature that is wounded, that is affected by Adam's sin, Adam's alienation from God. And one example or one analogy, one image that people often use is that of a crack baby, a baby born with an addiction to crack, heroin, whatever, because it contracts it in the womb. So the baby didn't smoke crack, the mother did. It was her sin, if I could put it that way. But the baby's affected by it and is born with an addiction. And so original sin for us is a state, you might say. It's not an act. Right? So, just to kind of recap, original sin means the personal sin that Adam committed, which produced the state in which all humanity has found itself after Adam, inheriting a wounded nature, one that must acquire knowledge, must struggle with concupiscence or the tendency to sin, and must die. So the implications of this, we can pull out a few that I think are worth talking about. First of all, comes the necessity for salvation. And so we don't really seek enlightenment, for instance. What we desire is salvation. And if we're caught up in Adam's sin because of the unity of the human race, right? And the fact that the whole race is in Adam as in one body, you know, well, we need another man then like Adam to pull us out of it, to pull all of humanity out of it. In other words, we need a savior, you know. And no other human being could do this. I mean, Buddha couldn't do it. Mahatma Gandhi couldn't do it. Moses couldn't do it. St. Peter couldn't do it. So God sent his Son to take on our human nature. And so gather all of humanity, you might say, in himself, right? So Jesus did that. He takes this human nature to himself, unites it to himself, and through his paschal mystery, frees human nature from the dominion of sin. That's why we say, frees us from sin, because we were caught in this state of original sin, right? So just as original sin affects all of humanity because of the unity of the human race, so also Christ's victory over sin and death, which is, again, a personal act on his part, still affects the rest of us and frees us from sin. That's why Jesus is called the new Adam. You know, you can see the parallel when I describe it that way. And just to connect it with the words we pray today, I'll use Eucharistic Prayer 4, and you'll hear these words, that when mankind had lost your friendship, you did not abandon him to the domain of death. So that's what that means. We use that word death to include all of the problems that come to human nature after Adam's sin. The other implication of this is one that gets people a little crazy, but because Peter says in one of his first sermons, we find it early in Acts, there is salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. You might remember Pope Benedict in his Regensburg address some years ago created a stir when he talked about this. Or a long time ago, 20-some years ago, when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith put out the document Dominus Jesus, which talked about the necessity of Jesus for salvation for all. The press went bonkers, you're setting interreligious dialogue back 100 years, all this stuff. No, it's logical. That's all it is. If by one man, Adam, in his sin affected us all and brought us into this state, one man, Jesus Christ, brought us out of it. His act brought freedom to human beings. And so clearly that person is the source of everyone's salvation. Whether you believe in him or not, or know him or not, whether you worship him or not, that's who brought it in, If you come in here and the lights are on, it doesn't matter if you know who turned the lights on or not. The lights are on, So it doesn't matter if you know who Jesus is. He's the one who healed human nature by his act. And that's all we mean by that. Now there's more we can go on, but that's the core of that. And so the next thing, the logical consequence of all this, so how do we appropriate that salvation for ourselves? Baptism. And for the Catholic Church, that's always been infant baptism first. And throughout history, and even today, there are many who will say that the church should wait to baptize someone until they're, quote, old enough to decide for themselves. That's a very common, I might even say universal Protestant idea, right? There are some Catholics who think that, but that idea comes from Protestantism. That's not to pick on anybody. I'm just saying this is a difference in how Protestants view something and how Catholics view it. See, for Protestants, baptism is a way of committing yourself to God. But we understand baptism to be more than that. Yes, that is part of it. That's a way you're configured to Christ. It's a way you come into the church. But it's also the way that original sin is wiped away. And if you think about it, especially in the early centuries of the church, right, we've nuanced our thinking about this a little bit. But if you think about this, it's a weak analogy, so don't hold me too far with this. But you wouldn't leave a crack baby to grow up addicted and say, well, when it's 12 or 16 or 20, it can make up its mind whether it wants to take drugs or not, or get off drugs. No, that's an affliction that child suffers. And so let's heal that affliction as soon as possible. And just because you baptize them, you're not forcing anyone to worship God or love God or anything. You're not even forcing them to go to Mass or we know quite a few people, unfortunately, that have been baptized as infants that don't practice their faith, don't come to church, don't believe in Jesus, whatever, You have the freedom to act however you want once you get old enough. what infant baptism is about is not forcing someone into the Catholic Church against their will, but it's about wiping away original sin. Especially if you think about the early centuries when we didn't quite understand everything fully, and we thought that if someone had original sin on their soul, they couldn't go to heaven. By God, you'd baptize them the next day. You know what I mean? Now, as I say, we've nuanced our thinking a little bit, but still, that's the idea. And that's why, that's the biggest reason, really, that Catholics believe in infant baptism, is because of that aspect. Protestants don't talk about original sin very much for a reason I'll mention in a minute. And so they're not worried about that, So then another implication, so what about human nature now? What about human beings, Well, original sin is wiped away in baptism, but the effects are still there, right? Even if you would heal that, get that child off, unaddicted, their body is still affected by being born with an addiction, The victory over sin and death that we talk about does not mean that we return back to the state of Adam and Eve. We've lost that, right? So where we go, what happens? We're not going back to Adam and Eve. So, and I talked about, we understand the situation we're in, right? So there are three ways of looking at human nature that are pretty common. And I always think of the, I can't ever think of her name, that whatever that story is, or something, the soup's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right, of Goldilocks. So this is my Goldilocks view of theology here. Around the 4th century, a monk named Pelagius started teaching that we human beings can, by the natural power of free will and without the necessity of God's grace, lead a morally good life and come to heaven. So we didn't need grace. We didn't need salvation. Adam's sin didn't affect us. It was just a very bad example. Don't do what he did, And so if you avoided that kind of thing, lived a good life, you could get to heaven all on your own. Goldilocks would say, that's too optimistic. The reformers, the Protestant reformers, came along and they said, no, original sin completely ruined human nature. The tendency to evil was insurmountable. We're lost. We have no chance at all. What did Jesus do? Well, you remember a couple images, I think I've mentioned them before. Luther talked about salvation or human nature as being a pile of dung covered with snow. That Jesus just covered over the problem, didn't fix it. Or if you want to take the image of going to court, So as we come to stand before the Father doesn't look at us, he looks at Jesus and sees the perfectly obedient Jesus and says, all right, go on in, you can go to heaven, go on in. He doesn't really look at us, he's just looking at Christ. Goldilocks would say that's too pessimistic. That Adam didn't ruin human nature, he wounded it, And that the problem there are a number of problems with we would say, with the Protestant view of salvation, but that's one of them, is that we're not really saved then. And that does offense to God's justice, that we never have to address our sin. Nothing has to be fixed or can be fixed. We're just a bunch of broken cars that belong in the junkyard, but we're putting them on the lot anyway, And then, so the middle thing for us, the Goldilocks is just right view, is that human nature is injured, but we still can, with grace, live a morally good life. And that our good works really are good works. They're really choices that we make. And we really do gain merit for the good that we do. Of course, we couldn't do that good without grace to help us. But we can make good moral decisions with grace. As a matter of fact, we have to. We're not saved against our will. We're saved in cooperation with grace. And so, just because Jesus died for us doesn't mean we're going to go to heaven. We have to be joined with Christ and joined with God. And so, you can see the idea we have of original sin and what Adam did has a lot of repercussions. It affects some of the other doctrines that we profess. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, about us really being able to make good choices and choose. You'll hear that also in the Eucharistic prayer. That you came in mercy to the aid of all, so that those who seek might find you. Those who want to do good really can do good, even if we need your help to do it. And so the last thing is, Paul writes, we heard this, the gift is not like the transgression. And so I said, what Jesus did is not allow us to return to the state of Adam and Eve before the fall. What's really marvelous is that what Jesus did for us brings us to a state better than we were before Adam and Eve sinned. We hear this in the Exultet on Easter Saturday night, Oh, happy fault, Felix culpa. Happy fault that won for us so great a Redeemer. And it's only in God that you can say, look back and say, boy, we really benefited from that evil. Which is weird, but we say that. And so the gift is not like the transgression. The transgression wounded us. The gift brings us to a better place even than we were before. So Adam and Eve lived with God. We can live in God. Adam and Eve lived a beautiful and blessed human life. We get to share in God's divine life now. Adam and Eve were immortal. We will die to this world, but we'll live an eternal life in God if we so desire. God's life can become our life. So I hope this is somewhat helpful. And not only to understand this original sin, but also it's one of the reasons to listen so carefully to the scriptures as they are proclaimed. Because it's from the scriptures most of the time that our doctrines and beliefs sprout.